I've spent 40 years looking into the eyes of people who are lost in the woods of their own making, and I can tell you one thing for certain. The hardest person to face isn't the one who hurt you, it's the one staring back at you in the mirror. When Mark walked onto my stage, he didn't just walk, he stormed. He carried the weight of 1,000 grievances, a literal library of reasons why his life was a disaster, and none of those reasons had anything to do with the man wearing the expensive Italian suit. He was a high-powered executive who could manage 100 employees but couldn't manage to keep a single meaningful relationship for more than 6 months. He looked at me with this mix of desperation and defiance, a look I've seen 10,000 times. It's the look of someone who is tired of running but hasn't yet realized they're the one chasing themselves. Mark wasn't just a guest. He was a case study in what I call the externalized life. That's when you outsource the responsibility for your happiness and your failures to everyone else in your orbit. To hear him tell it, his ex-wife was a monster, his business partners were thieves, and his parents were the architects of his misery. He had a story for every scar, a villain for every setback. But as I sat there, watching him adjust his tie for the 5th time, I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who had built a fortress out of excuses, and he was suffocating inside of it. My job isn't to agree with you. My job is to tell you the truth that your friends and family are too scared to say. I knew within 30 seconds of meeting Mark that we weren't going to have a polite conversation. We were going to have a collision, because you can't heal what you don't acknowledge, and Mark was currently acknowledging nothing but his own perceived righteousness. He sat down, crossed his legs, and gave me that smirk, the one that says, I'm the smartest guy in the room, and I'm going to win this interview. I just leaned back, looked him in the eye, and waited. Silence is a powerful tool. It forces people to sit with their own energy, and Mark's energy was vibrating with a frantic need to be right. We started with the basics. I wanted to see how he framed his world. Mark began to recount the story of his most recent divorce. According to him, she was impossible to please, emotionally volatile, and spent money like it was going out of style. He spoke about her with a cold, clinical detachment, as if he were presenting a quarterly earnings report on a failing subsidiary. I let him talk. I let him lay out his case brick by brick. He was building a wall of them, and they did this to me. She said that to me. He never once used the word I in the context of a mistake. As I listened, I started looking for the patterns. Psychology isn't just about what people say. It's about what they omit. Mark omitted any sense of personal agency. In his mind, he was a leaf caught in a hurricane, never realizing he was the wind. I started digging into his childhood, not because I want to live in the past, but because the past is where the blueprints are drawn. You don't just wake up one day and decide to blame the world for your problems. That's a learned behavior. That's a survival mechanism that outlived its usefulness. He grew up in a household where performance was the only currency. His father was a man who didn't accept anything less than perfection, but the target for perfection was always moving. If Mark got an A, why wasn't it an A+? If he won the game, why wasn't he the captain? In that environment, admitting a mistake wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a character flaw that invited shame. So, young Mark learned to pivot. He learned to deflect. If something went wrong, it had to be the coach's fault, the teacher's bias, or the equipment's failure. He survived his childhood by never being wrong. The problem is, he was still using that 8-year-old survival kit to navigate a 40-year-old's world. I watched him as he spoke about his father. There was a flicker of something there, a momentary crack in the armor, but he quickly patched it over with more jargon, more blame. He told me he hadn't spoken to his parents in 3 years because they were toxic. Now, I'm the first person to tell you to set boundaries with toxic people, but Mark's definition of toxic seemed to be anyone who held him accountable, anyone who asked him, hey, what was your part in this, was immediately labeled an enemy. This is the danger of the modern psychological age. People learn the vocabulary of therapy and use it as a weapon to avoid the work of therapy. They use terms like gaslighting and narcissism to describe anyone who disagrees with them. Mark was a master of this. He had weaponized his intelligence to ensure he never had to feel the sting of vulnerability. He was safe in his tower of blame, but he was also incredibly lonely. He didn't come to the show because he wanted to change. He came because he wanted me to validate his victimhood. He wanted Dr. Phil to tell the world that Mark was right and everyone else was wrong. I had to decide where to start pulling the thread. If you pull too hard, they shut down. If you don't pull hard enough, they just keep spinning their wheels. I decided to focus on the common denominator. It's a simple mathematical truth that most people hate to face. If you have 10 failed relationships and you're the only person who was present for all 10 of them, you might want to stop looking at the other 9 people and start looking at yourself. Mark wasn't ready for that math. He was still trying to solve the equation by changing the variables instead of the constant. The escalation began when I brought up his professional life. Mark had been fired from 3 high-level positions in 5 years. Each time, it was office politics or jealousy from his superiors. He described a conspiracy of mediocrity that was designed to hold him back. I asked him, Mark, do you really believe that 3 different companies in 3 different industries all conspired to fire a man they were paying $500,000 a year just because they were jealous? He didn't skip a beat. He told me I didn't understand the corporate landscape. He told me I was oversimplifying. That's when I knew we had to go deeper. We had to get past the corporate landscape and into the internal landscape. I started asking him about the people he had stepped on to get to the top. I asked him about the assistants who quit because of his temper. I asked him about the partners who felt bullied into silence. He dismissed them all as weak or not cut out for the big leagues. He was living in a world of winners and losers, and in his mind, being a winner meant never having to say, you're sorry. But here's the thing about people who think they're winners: because they never lose an argument, they lose everything else. They lose their families, they lose their peace of mind, and eventually they lose their grip on reality. Mark was on the verge of losing everything. He was currently embroiled in a lawsuit with his former business partner. His kids wouldn't return his calls, and he was on his 3rd bottle of scotch a week. The pressure was building, and the steam had to go somewhere. He was a pressure cooker with a tape-down valve, and I was about to peel the tape off. The air in the studio was thick. You could feel the audience holding their breath. They could see what Mark couldn't, that he was a man drowning in his own ego. I looked at the monitors and saw his hands. He was gripping the armrests of the chair so hard his knuckles were white. He was prepared for a fight. He wasn't prepared for the truth. He thought he was there to win an argument, but I was there to help him lose the one thing that was killing him: his pride. The tension in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a dull knife. Mark sat there, leaning forward now, his jaw set in a way that told me he was ready to litigate every single point I made. He wasn't listening to understand, he was listening to rebut. I've seen this 1,000 times. It's a cognitive filter that screens out anything that doesn't support the internal narrative. In Mark's narrative, he was the hero of a tragedy, a man of high standards living in a world of low expectations. But the reality was far more mundane and far more painful. He was a man who used his intellect as a shield to keep from feeling his own inadequacy. I decided to pivot. I wanted to talk about his children. Nothing gets through the armor like the truth of what we've done to the people we claim to love the most. I asked him about his daughter, Sarah. I'd seen the video of her interview before we went to tape. She was 22, and she looked like she'd lived 40 years in those 22. She had this hollowed out look in her eyes, the look of someone who had spent her entire life trying to earn a love that was always conditional on her performance. Mark sighed, a long, theatrical exhale that was meant to convey his exhaustion with her drama. He told me that Sarah was unstable, that she'd been influenced by her mother, and that she was ungrateful for everything he'd provided. He started listing the tuition he'd paid, the cars he'd bought, the vacations he'd funded. It was a ledger. He was trying to buy his way out of a moral bankruptcy. I stopped him right there. I told him, Mark, she didn't ask for a Lexus, she asked for a father. And you gave her a checkbook because a checkbook doesn't require you to be vulnerable. A checkbook doesn't require you to say, I'm sorry I missed your graduation because I was closing a deal. His eyes narrowed. He told me I was being unfair, that I was taking the side of a rebellious child over a man who had sacrificed his life for his family. That's the payoff right there. That's the psychological benefit he gets from his behavior. By being the sacrificial provider, he gets to be the martyr. And martyrs don't have to be accountable. Martyrs are above the fray. I leaned in closer. I wanted to get into his personal space, metaphorically speaking. I said, Mark, let's look at the math again. You say everyone else is the problem. Your ex-wife is crazy. Your business partners are scammers. Your daughter is ungrateful. Your son is lazy. Your parents were cold. If you walked into a room and everyone else was wearing a red shirt, you might be the odd man out. But if you walk into every room you've ever entered for 40 years and everyone is wearing a red shirt, at some point, you have to realize you're the one wearing the red tinted glasses. He didn't like that. He started to get agitated, shifting in his seat, his voice rising in pitch. He began to dissect my analogy, trying to find a logical flaw in it. He was playing chess while his life was on fire. I let him go for a minute. I let him show the audience exactly who he was when he felt cornered. He became sharp, condescending, and arrogant. He started using big words to try and make me feel small. It's a classic bully tactic, and it usually works because most people don't like conflict. But I'm not most people. I've been in the ring with the best of them, and Mark was telegraphing every punch. The escalation wasn't just in his voice, it was in the facts we were bringing to light. We had reached out to his former business partner, a man named David, who had been Mark's best friend since college. David had sent us a statement, and when I started reading it, I saw Mark's face go pale. David didn't call him a monster. He didn't call him a thief. He called him lonely. He said, Mark is the most successful man I know who has absolutely no one to share it with. He'd rather be right and alone than wrong and loved. That hit home. You could see the flicker of pain behind Mark's eyes, but he quickly smothered it with anger. He called David a weak-minded follower who couldn't handle the pressure of a real business. He was doubling down. When you're in a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging. But Mark was trying to dig his way to the other side of the world. He was convinced that if he just explained himself one more time, if he just found the right combination of words, he could convince me and himself that he was the victim. I decided it was time to show him the mirror room. That's what I call the part of the process where I stop talking and let the person's own history speak for itself. We played a montage of interviews we'd done with the people in his life. One after another, they all said the same thing. They all used different words, but the melody was the same. Mark is a wall. You can't get through to him. You can't talk to him. You can only agree with him or leave. As the clips played, I watched Mark. He wasn't looking at the screen, he was looking at his shoes. He was trying to disconnect. He was trying to go to that place in his mind where he's safe, where he's the only one who knows the truth. But the voices were coming from all sides. It was a chorus of the people he'd left behind. When the lights came back up in the studio, There was a heavy silence. Even the audience was quiet. They weren't judging him anymore, they were pitying him. And for a man like Mark, pity is worse than hatred. Pity means you're not a threat, pity means you're broken. I asked him, Mark, how does it feel to hear the people you love say they can't talk to you? He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes weren't angry, they were wet. He said, they don't understand the pressure I'm under. There it was, the pivot back to the excuse. I told him, we all have pressure, Mark. Pressure is a part of life, but you're using your pressure as a license to be a jerk. You're using your success as a shield against intimacy. You think that because you provide the house, you don't have to provide the home. He started to argue, but the wind was out of his sails. He was starting to realize that his old tricks weren't working. He couldn't out-talk me, and he couldn't out-logic the pain on his daughter's face. We were moving toward the confrontation, the moment where the wall finally has to come down. I could see him struggling. Part of him wanted to run out of the studio, to get back into his expensive car and drive away from this uncomfortable truth. But another part of him, the part that had led him to the show in the first place, was tired. He was exhausted from the weight of his own ego. I told him, you've spent your whole life building a monument to Mark, and it's a beautiful monument. It's made of granite and gold, but nobody wants to live in a monument, Mark. People want to live in a house. They want a place where they can be messy, where they can make mistakes, where they can be forgiven. You've created a world where there is no room for mistakes, which means there is no room for people. Because people are nothing but a collection of mistakes and beautiful intentions. He sat there, his shoulders slumped for the first time. The executive Mark was starting to dissolve, and the little boy Mark, who was afraid of his father's disapproval, was starting to peek through. This is the most dangerous and the most hopeful part of the process. If he shuts down now, he's gone forever. If he opens up, we might be able to save what's left of his life. I had to be careful. I had to be the clinch in the boxing match, holding him up so he didn't fall, but also not letting him get away. I asked him, what are you so afraid would happen if you just said, I messed up? He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the audience, then back at me. He said, if I'm wrong about one thing, then I might be wrong about everything. And if I'm wrong about everything, then who am I? That is the core of the problem. That is the existential dread that keeps people trapped in their toxic patterns. They equate their behavior with their identity. If I do a bad thing, I am a bad person. If I make a mistake, I am a failure. I told him, Mark, you are not your mistakes, but you are responsible for them. There is a huge difference between I failed and I am a failure. You've been living as if you were a failure, so you've been fighting like a cornered animal to prove you're a success. But a real success is a man who can look his daughter in the eye and say, I was selfish and I'm sorry. That takes more courage than any business deal you've ever closed. That takes more strength than any argument you've ever won. He took a deep breath, and I could see the internal battle playing out on his face. The man he thought he was fighting the man he needed to become. The silence in the studio was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it has a physical weight. Mark was sitting there, staring into the middle distance, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head. He was at a crossroads. One path led back to the safety of his excuses, back to the world where he was the misunderstood genius surrounded by idiots. The other path led somewhere he'd never been, to the truth of his own making. I watched him closely, looking for any sign of the old executive Mark trying to reassert control. Usually, when someone gets this close to a breakthrough, their ego starts screaming. It feels like a death, because in a way, it is. The version of himself he'd spent 40 years polishing was dying right there on national television. I didn't want to break him. I wanted to break the patterns that were breaking him. There's a big difference. I leaned back in my chair and took a breath. Mark, I said, let's talk about the payoff. In psychology, we know that people don't keep doing things that don't work unless there's a payoff. You don't stay angry, you don't stay isolated, and you don't stay in a state of constant conflict unless you're getting something out of it. So, what's the payoff for being the guy who is always right and always alone? He looked at me, genuinely puzzled for a second. He started to say there was no payoff, that he hated being lonely. I stopped him. Don't give me the Sunday school answer, I told him. Give me the real answer. When you're right and everyone else is wrong, you get to be superior. You get to be the judge and the jury. You never have to be vulnerable because you've already decided that everyone else is beneath your standard. The payoff is control. As long as you're the victim of a mediocre world, you never have to risk being an equal in a relationship, because being an equal means you might actually have to listen. It means you might have to change. He didn't argue. That was the first real sign that we were getting somewhere. Usually at this point, he would have had a 3-point rebuttal ready, but he just sat there, and I saw his hand tremble slightly as he reached for the water glass on the table between us. I decided to push a little harder. I asked him to think about his son, Leo. We talked to Leo too. Leo was 19, a sophomore in college, and he'd told our producers that he'd stop calling his dad because every conversation turned into a lecture. Leo said, "My dad doesn't want a son, he wants a trophy. And if the trophy has a scratch on it, he wants to throw it away." I asked Mark, how does it feel to know that your son thinks he's a piece of hardware to you? Mark's face twisted. "That was a lie," he said, his voice cracking. He said he loved Leo more than anything, that everything he did was for Leo's future. I told him, "Mark, I believe you love him, but you're loving him the way you wanted to be loved, not the way he needs to be loved. You're repeating the same cycle your father started with you. Your father gave you a checklist instead of a childhood, and now you're doing the same thing to Leo. You think you're being a good provider, but you're actually being a ghost. You're there physically and you're there financially, but you're not there emotionally. And the reason you're not there is because you're terrified that if you let him see the real you, the guy who makes mistakes, the guy who gets scared, the guy who doesn't have all the answers, that he won't respect you." But the truth is, Mark, respect is earned through integrity, and integrity starts with being honest about who you are. This was the escalation point. I could feel the energy in the room shifting toward a boiling point. Mark's posture changed again. He went from slumped to rigid. He told me I was overstepping. He said I didn't know his father, and I didn't know what it took to build the kind of life he'd built. He started talking about the 18-hour days, the stress, the sleepless nights. He was trying to justify his behavior by pointing to his bank account again. It's a common defense mechanism for high achievers. They think their net worth is a substitute for their self-worth. I told him, I don't care how many zeros are in your bank account, Mark. You can't buy back the years you've lost with your children. You can't buy a peaceful night's sleep. You're a rich man living a very poor life. He snapped. He stood up, pacing the small area in front of his chair. He started shouting about how I was twisting his words, how the show was a setup, how everyone was just looking for a gotcha moment. This is what I call the extinction burst. It's that last desperate explosion of the old behavior before it finally gives up. I didn't get up. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there and watched him. I waited for the storm to pass. When you're dealing with someone who uses anger to control their environment, the best thing you can do is remain an unmovable object. If I get angry, he wins, because then the conversation is about my anger instead of his choices. After about a minute of venting, he ran out of steam. He stood there, breathing hard, looking around the studio like he'd forgotten where he was. I said, "Sit down, Mark." He hesitated, then he sat. I told him, "I'm not your enemy. I'm the only person in your life right now who isn't afraid of you and who doesn't want anything from you. I don't want your money. I don't want your approval, and I'm not impressed by your title. I'm just a guy looking at another guy who is about to lose everything that matters, and I'm trying to hand you a life jacket. But you have to stop trying to drown me while I'm giving it to you." He put his head in his hands. The bravado was gone. The executive had left the building. We sat in that silence for a long time. I wanted him to feel the weight of it. I wanted him to realize that the only person he was really fighting was himself. I asked him, "What's it going to be, Mark? Are you going to go home and tell yourself that doctor, Phil is an idiot, and continue on this path until you're sitting in a mansion all by yourself with no one to call? Or are you going to admit that you've been wrong? Not just about the business deals or the divorces, but wrong about how you've been showing up in the world?" He looked up at me, and his eyes were completely different. The hardness was gone. He looked exhausted. But it was a good kind of exhausted. It was the exhaustion of someone who has finally stopped running. He whispered, "I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to be any other way." That was the breakthrough. That was the moment of surrender. When a man like Mark admits he doesn't know what to do, that's when the real work can begin. Up until that point, he was his own expert, and his expertise had led him to a dead end. Now, he was finally ready to be a student. I told him the first step is the hardest, and you just took it. You admitted you don't have the answers. Now we can start looking for them. But we're not going to look for them in your spreadsheets or your legal briefs. We're going to look for them in your heart. We're going to look at that little boy who was told he had to be perfect to be loved, and we're going to tell him that he's enough just as he is. I sat there with him in that quiet for what felt like an eternity, but in television time, it was only a few seconds. Those seconds are where the real work happens. It's the space between the old self and the new possibility. I told Mark that we were going to do something he hadn't done in decades. We were going to stop talking about his legacy and his reputation, and we were going to talk about his soul. I brought his daughter, Sarah, out onto the stage. She hadn't wanted to come at first. She was terrified of the man she knew as a human hurricane, the one who leveled everything in his path with a single critique. When she sat down, she wouldn't even look at him. She stared at me, her hands trembling in her lap. I looked at Mark and saw the old defense mechanism start to flare up. He started to adjust his tie, his spine straightened, and that executive mask began to slide back over his features. I stopped him right there. I said, "Mark, don't you dare. Don't go back to the bunker. If you go back in there now, the door's going to lock, and you're going to be the only one with a key in a room full of ghosts. Look at your daughter. Don't look at her as a critic or a disappointment. Look at her as a human being who is bleeding because of the choices you've made." Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. He forced himself to stay present. I turned to Sarah and asked her what she wanted to say to her father, not the executive, but the man. She took a shaky breath and said, "I just wanted to know if I was ever enough for you. I wanted to know if I had to be the best at everything just so you'd notice me. Because when I wasn't the best, you weren't there." Mark started to open his mouth to explain, to tell her about the trust fund, to tell her about the elite schools. I held up my hand. "Mark," I said, "if you mention money right now, I'm going to walk off this stage." She's talking about her heart, and you're talking about your wallet. Those two things don't even speak the same language. I told him to look at her and say 4 words. "I was wrong, Sarah." He struggled with it. It was like he was trying to swallow a stone. The word wrong was anathema to him. It was the thing he'd spent 40 years avoiding. But eventually, in a voice so low I could barely hear it, he said it, I was wrong. That was the crack in the dam. Once those words were out, the rest started to pour. He didn't just say he was wrong, he started to realize the cost of his perfection. He looked at Sarah and saw not a project or a reflection of his own success, but a woman he'd almost completely lost. This is what I call the realignment. It's when you finally align your actions with your stated values. Mark always said he valued family, but his actions valued ego and control. You can't have both. Control is the opposite of intimacy. You can either be in control or you can be in a relationship, but you can't be in both at the same time. I watched as he reached out a hand toward her, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. She didn't take it yet, but she didn't pull away. That's progress. That's a start. We spent the next hour breaking down the life script he'd been following. A life script is a set of instructions we give ourselves in childhood to survive, and we keep following them long after the danger has passed. Mark's script was, if I am perfect, I am safe. If I am the best, I won't be rejected. I told him, Mark, the very thing you use to keep yourself safe is the thing that's making you miserable. You're safe from criticism, maybe, but you're also safe from love. And love is messy. Love is full of mistakes. If you can't handle being wrong, you can't handle being loved. He admitted that he'd been living in a state of constant anxiety, terrified that someone would see through the suit and the titles to the scared kid underneath. This is the imposter syndrome taken to a pathological level. He wasn't just afraid of being a fraud at work, he was afraid of being a fraud as a human being. The confrontation didn't end with a hug and a Hollywood ending. That's not how real life works, and it's certainly not how my show works. Real life is grittier than that. We had to talk about the business partner he'd burned, the employees he'd bullied, and the son who still wouldn't come to the studio. I told Mark that he had a long restitution phase ahead of him. You don't get to just say, I'm sorry, and have 40 years of wreckage disappear. You have to earn the right to be back in these people's lives. You have to show up day after day without an agenda, without an ego, and without a defense. You have to be willing to sit in the fire of their anger and not try to put it out with your excuses. I asked him if he was willing to do the work, not for a week or a month, but for the rest of his life. He looked at Sarah, and then he looked at me and he said, I don't have anything else left to do. Everything else I've built is empty. As we moved toward the conclusion of the session, I could see the shift in his physical presence. The tension in his shoulders had dropped. His voice had lost that sharp, clinical edge. He was still the same man, but the operating system had been reset. I told him that I was going to provide him with the best resources, top-tier therapists who specialize in high-conflict personalities and family reconciliation. But I warned him, those therapists are going to be like me. They aren't going to buy your act. They aren't going to be impressed by your resume. They're going to hold up a mirror every single day, and you have to promise not to break it. Mark nodded. He seemed to understand that his smarts were his biggest obstacle. He had to learn to be dumb for a while, to not have the answers, to not have the plan, to just be. I sat with him backstage after the cameras stopped rolling. This is where the real conversations happen, away from the lights and the audience. He asked me, Doctor, Phil, do you think they'll ever forgive me? I looked at him and gave him the truth. I said, Mark, I don't know. Some of them might, some of them might not. You've done a lot of damage, and you have to accept that as part of your reality. But here's the thing, you aren't doing this for their forgiveness. You're doing this for your own integrity. You're doing this so that when you put your head on the pillow at night, you aren't fighting a war with yourself. If they forgive you, that's a blessing. If they don't, you still have to be a man of character. You can't control their reaction, You can only control your action. He took that in. It wasn't the comfort he wanted, but it was the truth he needed. He left the studio that day not as a winner, but as a man who had finally joined the human race. And in my book, that's the biggest victory there is. Watching Mark walk out of the studio was like watching a man step off a cliff and realize for the first time that he actually had a parachute. He just hadn't bothered to pull the cord for 40 years. But the walk to the car is easy. It's the walk into your house that's hard. It's the silence that greets you when you realize that your money can buy you a state-of-the-art security system, but it can't buy the sound of laughter in the hallway. I checked in on Mark a few weeks after the show. I wanted to see if the studio high had worn off and been replaced by the old crusty habits of a lifetime. Change isn't an event, it's a process. It's a series of small, often painful choices that you make every single day when no one is watching and there are no cameras to capture your breakthrough. Mark's transition wasn't smooth. It was messy, just like I told him it would be. He started the intensive therapy we arranged, and for the first 3 sessions, he tried to manage the therapist. He tried to set the agenda. He tried to use his executive vocabulary to bypass the emotional labor. And he even tried to fire the therapist when things got uncomfortable. But this therapist was handpicked by me. She didn't blink. She just sat there and asked him, "How's that working for you, Mark?" And eventually, the walls started to crumble again. He called me once, late at night, sounding more human than I'd ever heard him. He told me he had tried to call his son, Leo. He'd left a voicemail. And for the first time in his life, he didn't give advice, he didn't mention the tuition, and he didn't ask for anything. He just said, "Leo, I was a bad father because I was a selfish man. I'm learning how to be better. I'm here if you ever want to talk. And I'll be here even if you don't." Leo didn't call back for a month. That's the reality of the situation. You don't get to set the timeline for someone else's healing just because you've decided to start yours. Mark had to sit in that uncomfortable space of silence. He had to learn that he couldn't negotiate his way back into his son's life. He had to learn that the outcome wasn't something he could control. He spent that month doing the hard work of looking at his past without the rose-colored glasses of his own ego. He went back to his office and had a meeting with David, the business partner he'd alienated. He didn't ask for his job back. He didn't ask for the lawsuit to be dropped. He just sat there and listened to David tell him how much he'd been hurt. Mark told me later that it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, to sit there and not defend himself, to just take it. But that's what accountability looks like. It's not a speech. It's a seat at the table of the people you've wronged, and you don't get to speak until they're finished. As the months went by, the executive Mark began to fade into the background. He didn't lose his intelligence or his drive, but he redirected them. He started volunteering at a local youth center, teaching business skills to kids who didn't have the advantages he'd had. But this time, he wasn't doing it for the tax write-off or the plaque on the wall. He was doing it because he realized that his success was hollow if it wasn't shared. He was learning to be a mentor instead of a master. He was learning that the most powerful thing a man can do is be vulnerable. His relationship with Sarah remained fragile, but they were talking. They went to lunch once a week. They didn't talk about the past every time. Sometimes they just talked about the weather or a book they'd read. It was a slow, deliberate rebuilding of a foundation that had been cracked for decades. I often think about Mark when I'm dealing with guests who are stuck in that blame-shifting loop. I think about the courage it took for a man of his stature to admit that he was the common denominator in his own misery. We live in a culture that encourages us to find a scapegoat for everything. It's always the government, the economy, our parents, our toxic exes. We've become a society of victims, and while there are certainly real victims in this world, there are also a lot of people who use their victimhood as a way to avoid the mirror. Mark chose to break that cycle. He chose to stop being a victim of his own success and start being the architect of his own character. The last time I spoke to him, he wasn't wearing the Italian suit. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and he looked 10 years younger. The lines of tension around his eyes had softened. He told me that he had finally had a real conversation with Leo. It wasn't a perfect conversation. There were still tears and there was still anger, but it was honest. And for Mark, honesty was the greatest luxury he'd ever known. He said, "Doctor, Phil, I spent 40 years trying to be the smartest guy in the room. Now, I'm just happy to be in the room." That's when I knew he'd made it. He'd moved from the externalized life to an internalized truth. He wasn't blaming anyone else anymore. He was taking full, radical responsibility for the man he was and the man he wanted to be. We all have a Mark inside of us. We all have that part of ourselves that wants to point the finger, that wants to be right instead of being happy, that wants to hide our flaws behind a resume or a bank account. But the lesson of Mark's story is that the fortress we build to protect ourselves eventually becomes our prison. The only way out is through the front door of accountability. It's painful, it's humiliating, and it's the only path to real freedom. Mark didn't get a happily ever after in the traditional sense. He still has bad days. He still has to fight the urge to be the boss in every situation. But he's no longer a stranger to himself. He knows what he is, and more importantly, he knows who he is. And that, in the end, is the only win that actually matters. He's no longer the man who blamed everyone else. He's the man who finally had the guts to look in the mirror and say, "I'm here and I'm ready to change."